Yes, good. So we're going to be talking about modifying bond ladders, all right? So the first question you need to ask, though, is, well, let's see here. Where's this go? Oh, we're just going to use that. All right. What is a bond ladder? All right. So this is a strategy that is used by some pensioners where you essentially start off with some initial bond investment, all right? And what you do is you receive coupons over a fixed period of time, and every time you receive them, you keep them, and on a fixed investment schedule, you buy more bonds. Basically, it's a rollover strategy. Every time you receive cash, you wait and then until your date comes to reinvest that cash, and then you buy more bonds. So every time you buy another bond, that is considered a bond run, all right? And you usually stack these runs one on top of the other over time, and that's why it's considered a bond ladder. So what we are interested in, given this bond ladder scheme, is we're wondering, is there a way for which we can improve on this bond ladder scheme? So specifically, we are interested in addressing the convexity risk, which is common to bonds portfolios as a whole, and especially bond ladders. So to that end, the way we wish to approach this is as follows. We want to figure out, can we make some adaptive modifications to improve performance of bond ladders? And if so, what are the best methods to do so? All right? So in what follows, we will be showing you majorly how we've constructed our process in order to solve this problem. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Tony to give you some of the underlying ideas of the way we approach that.
Okay, so now I will introduce the entire procedure, how we implement the entire algorithm. So at first, we should collect the historical data from the Fed. The Fed publish yield data every day, so we can extract them. And then we'll conduct a yield curve bootstrap. So for the yield data, we have a problem because the bond have different maturities. It has 3 months, 6 months, or 20 years. So almost all data are concentrated in the short time to maturity. So to prevent the problem of collinearity, we need to bootstrap the data and extract the data from yield curve and evenly take the data to fit the model. After we get the bootstrap data, we should feed a dynamic Nelson-Segal model, which is a model that we usually use to fit a yield curve. Then, with this kind of yield, we want to use the model to project for the future. So it comes to a yield curve forecast. After that, we'll do a simulation about our portfolio process. Then we estimate the best bond type that we should trade. We should buy or sell or strip. Then we should calculate the optimal stopping time of when we should do with the bond. And for the last one, we should select the best action we should take. This will maximize our portfolio and reduce the risk. Okay, so now I'll talk about the spot rate modeling with Nelson-Segal model. So this is how a bond object looks like. So look at the picture name's caption. Okay, we have a start date from 2005 to 2020. So we can interpret it as a stock data. So the yield rate fluctuates and it grows over time. Well, look at the other axis. We have the maturity. So in a given date, we have different maturities. So we should see the yield as a 3D object that we should consider it as a surface. So what we want to do is, given all the surface data, we want to project the future surface. So in order to project the future surface, we have two things to do. The first is we fit a model using the past data, then we project out the future. So the Nelson-Segal model is a common model that we use to fit a bond curve, a yield curve. So what it does is it decomposes the yield curve into a linear combination of levels, slope, and curvatures. So we have different terms here. For example, we have lambda, we have tau. Tau represents the time to maturity, like 1 month, 3 months, that kind of information. And the lambda is a tuning parameter. So the term inside the brackets are all known. So we could fit a regression to get the level, slope, and curvature. So this is a matrix form of the Nelson-Siegel model. All the y's are the yield rate in a given date. So this is a static case, so it's for a given day. And we have the phi. The phi matrix is everything we know, because we know the time to maturities and the lambda. Then the x is something we want to estimate. So this model actually put the modeling of a surface into a modeling of several scalars. So by using those basis functions, we'll only need to track the level, slope, and curvature and track how they evolve over time. So you could interpret the yield curve as the combination of these 3 curves. And we use these 3 curves to multiply by 3 scalars, we have a yield curve. So after we've done the modeling for the past data, we should forecast about the future. So how we measure the evolution of the data? We put it in a state space model. So the x are the latent state at time t, which are level, slope, and curvature. So we use how the x evolves to get how the y evolves. So for the state-based model, we put them in a Kalman filter, which is the technique that we track the data and project about the future. So there are several steps we need to do. The first one is to do the state prediction. The state prediction is we use the past data to predict about the x, the state, the level, slope, and curvature we got. And then we do the observation prediction. So we have all the x, we then transform it back to a yield curve. Then the third step is state filtering. So after we predict about the 1 step ahead, for example, the yield for tomorrow, and when tomorrow comes, we have the data about tomorrow, we need to do an adjustment to track, to take all the predictions back on track. Okay, and the last step we need to do is for the parameter estimation. For example, we have 6 parameters to estimate, and okay, I'll first introduce how we do the state prediction. So given the data yesterday, we want to predict the x of t, which is today. So given all the past data, it follows a multivariate normal distribution. So we marginalize the x t minus 1 out to get a distribution of the x at the current time. And for this one, we could get the expected value and the variance of x, which will be used for future step. And after get the distribution of xc, we use the value of xc to predict about yt, which is the goal of the entire algorithm, is to predict about the future yields. So we have the expected value of the yield and the variance of yields conditioned on the time. So for future prediction, and using the mean and variance, we could do a Monte Carlo about the future yields, which is a core element in this algorithm. Then after getting all the information, for example, we get the information about today, we could adjust everything about our prediction. So the prediction might not be accurate, we need to use the current data to make it up to date. So we use the Kalman again to make this adjustment. And we derive the distribution of xc by calculating the conditional distribution. So this is how a Kalman filter like. For example, sorry about the plot is kind of small, but I'll explain, because we make an example about 1 year bond, 5 year bond, 10 years bond, and 20 years bond. So we track all the data in the past and project about future. You can see the green prediction data and the confidence interval. So maybe you've noticed that the confidence interval is getting bigger because intuitively the uncertainty increases if we predict for a longer time. But actually, if the transition matrix is stationary, we could see that after, for example, 100 days, 200 days, the confidence interval will be a constant and the entire process will be stationary. So here comes to the part that take me most of the time to finish the algorithm. It's the parameter estimation. So there are two types of, we want to apply maximum likelihood, and there are two types of likelihood, the complete data likelihood and marginal data likelihood. So since we have no information about XC, which is something we estimate, it's not unknown data, so we choose to maximize the marginal likelihood, which is something we want because the prediction accuracy of YT is the only thing we need. Then we compute the log marginal likelihood for the observation, and then we do a gradient descent. So we use a coordinate descent to maximize the likelihood. And we have to calculate the partial likelihood entry by entry because we're doing an update for each parameters. So that might take a lot of time to do it. Also, it's computationally expensive. So in practice, we just do a simple VAR model for the simulation studies. So the gradient descent, it takes about 10 minutes to finish. So if I spend 10 minutes every day, it's going to be fine. But for the simulation study, we have to put like 100 days of data together, and 10 minutes times 100 is not really good. So we just do a naive VAR model. So we track how the level, slope, and curvature evolves over time. So it's basically a AR process, vector form, and only depends on the data of the last day. So after this, all our procedure about the bond prediction is finished. So with the result I get from the yield curve prediction, we could actually compute the bond present value in a more accurate sense and determine the cash flow from the action we did, like selling the bond, stripping the bond. And that's pretty much everything we get from the prediction of the bond.
Yes, so on that matter, we're essentially taking the yields from our yield curve model in order to discount our cash flows. That is where our Nelson-Siegel model output appears right here, the yields, all right? So these G functions right here, these are just products of indicator functions, which are there to help you basically determine, hey, when should my cash flow disappear when I make a given action? Actions which we are going to discuss right now. So but before we get to that, Tony, let's talk about the portfolio. All right, so first I'll address a quick typo right here. So this actually should be a difference between this and this right here, surplus and deficit. So I would like to talk about quickly how we're assessing our portfolio, right? So you have a cash position, as I began with, and then you also have the potential to go in debt or have a surplus. Hence, we decide to have two separate initializations for, hey, do we use too much money and we go into debt, we buy a lot of bonds with money we don't have, we would have deficit, otherwise we would have a surplus. We have these indicator functions right here, which relative to our cash position, they determine whether or not our deficit and surplus are zero. So one must be zero, while the other one must have some value, assuming your cash position is, of course, positive. We assume that you will always be paying off any debt you have the moment you bring in cash, all right? So, on to the next one, please. So, to that end, we append this sort of action space to it, all right? So, with the way you see it right here, this is a very special set of functions which I derived custom for switching cash between your cash position and your bond asset portfolio. So I have built these H functions right here for when you sell a bond perhaps, or bring in cash flows, or buy bonds and such, of which I will be showing you in the next slide coming up next here. So Tony, on to the next one. So just to address a few more assumptions before we talk about those functions, we are assuming when we're discussing this portfolio, all right, that we are going to have a fixed investment schedule where you regularly buy bonds on 1 month intervals, okay? Secondary to that is, of course, we have unrestricted borrowing and lending with the same rate of borrowing and lending, all right? Now, realistic, is it? No, but for our purposes, it helps simplify matters for the points and visuals we're going to be examining later. So, in addition, we only assume you're allowed to take one action within each investment period, all right? What is an investment period? Well, you have these 2 dates between when you buy your bonds, all right? So buy bond one date, buy bond next date. In that interval, what actions do we want to take, okay? So we want to make one, and we're going to tell you what those actions are going to be. So Tony, next. All right, so these are the H functions for the case where you make no action, or in particular, where you transition from one investment period to the next, all right? In the case where you make no actions, these H functions are set to 0, all right? And of course, for your synthetic action, it also performs the same function, all right? So in essence, whenever you move forward in time, your surplus or your deficit will evolve according to whatever lending or borrowing rate you will have, all right? All right, so how are these functions defined when we sell bonds, all right? When we sell bonds, the idea is whatever bonds you sell, so subject to whatever action is conducted on these bonds, where Nij consists of the face value times the number of bonds you have, you have this neat little way of saying, oh, if I go over, say, like if I pay off my deficit, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to transition to my surplus by this amount, all right? And then vice versa for my deficit. So these H functions are there to help us switch between our deficit and our surplus, all right? So, Tony, go on to the next one. Now, I want to get into our selection algorithm very quickly, but before we do that, I should just very quickly say, the second action which we are adding to our action space, which is important to note, is bond stripping. When you strip a bond, you take the coupons in a coupon bond and you sell them as a separate asset. So to that end, we are interested in seeing what happens when you include selling and stripping in your action space. So to that end, we have a procedure for determining whether or not you want to sell or strip, on what bond you wish to sell or strip on, and the earliest time for which you would choose to do that. Those are the 3 actions we are interested in examining, and to that end, we are going to move on to the process by which we make this selection process. So, next slide, please. Thank you. So, first, we have this construct right here, W, all right? This W function represents the difference between your portfolio when you make an action versus the portfolio where you don't make an action, all right? And we are interested in evaluating this at some forecasted date and time, in particular, the next date we will be buying bonds. I will call this date the terminal date, all right? So we evaluate this at our terminal date, and we evaluate it in the active bond portfolio that we have, so the current bonds we have, all right? So next. So upon initializing these W functions, which we use Monte Carlo simulation to conduct using the forecasts from our Kalman filter, what we do is we try to find the most optimal bond to sell or strip upon. In this case, we condition on a given action, and then we only decide which action will work at the end, which I will get to shortly. So, to that extent, we have this fancy set of math for which we are interested in maximizing a joint probability where we care about whether or not the portfolio, given that you sell a single bond, right? We care about whether or not that difference constructed from that, whether or not it's the largest of all the bonds you could choose to sell. So this J right here, that's an index which would correspond to whatever unique bond type that is. In addition, provided that's the bond you use, we also care about this joint probability right here. This is dead. We care about this we care about this other component right here. We want to make sure that that W is actually positive, indicating that our do something portfolio is actually better than our do nothing portfolio. So this is the estimation procedure we do. We use our Monte Carlo samples as part of the estimate for that probability to then figure out which choice of bond within that W function maximizes it. So this is how we choose our bond. This gives us the index that we want. All right, on to the next one. What we then have, once we have this bond index, is we construct a set of value functions. These will be important for our stopping rule, all right? So how does this work? Well, what we do is from our simulated data, you can imagine I'll build like 1,000 of these W estimates across each bond I could choose to action upon, all right? So what I do is from those Monte Carlo estimates, I'm able to just directly plug those into our estimates for our value functions, all right? And I'll explain the role that those play in the next slide right here. So how does this work exactly? So you can see I choose my stopping time by comparing my W function as of an earlier date. Iteratively, we figure out which of these is when this condition is satisfied early. And the analogy I would give, which explains what this means intuitively, is imagine you're at, let's say you have like Tinder on your phone, okay? And you have like a finite number of swipes, and you want to try to get within 30 days, like find some match, all right? So when you're earlier in the game, you have more options, all right? So you'll be saying, oh, you know, this person, do I like them or not? I don't know. So you'll be more willing to reject more partners, all right? However, as you get closer to your terminal date, you have less women or men or whoever in your pool to consider, all right? So because of that, you might get more desperate to find a right match for yourself, all right? And then as you get towards that end, that's when you're really just gonna be swiping as much as you can. So the way our stopping rule works then, in essence, is as you get closer towards that terminal date, when you move forward in time, you tend to be more likely to choose a stopping time which is earlier to you. So keeping that in mind, we then get into some fun study business. So I want to preface this by saying when I went through and I designed the code for this project, I couldn't just do this trivially. There are so many moving parts that go into it that I had to break things down. You know, there was an economist that once told me to eat an elephant, you do so one bite at a time. Each object I constructed was a bite. All right. So there's the main meal, which is my bond portfolio, and then within that, I contain these subsets of objects. The cash position we wish to track, the yield model, which we use to facilitate the valuing of our cash flows, and then the bonds, which go into a ledger, which contains which bonds are active, which transactions I've ever made, and of course, a dictionary containing a history of all the bonds and that we've ever had. So that way we can go and backtrack our transactions. So let's move on to our simulation study then. So we're adding some more conditions as part of the simulation study. Start off with $100,000, all right? You begin with two 11-year bonds that have 3% quarterly coupons, $10,000 principal, and then every 30 days, basically roughly 30 days, I did this at the end of every month, you choose to buy two more 10-year bonds with the same coupon rate, period, and principal, all right? Other things to note, I don't know why we called this risk-free rate. It's just the borrowing and lending rate that we have. So in this case, we assume that to be 3%, and we assume that they are equivalent. So in addition, we allow selling and stripping in addition to static and synthetic actions. So we wish to see what performance we get out of that, all right? And what follows, I wish to note to you that the dates that we have are arbitrary. So for our case, even though we wish to use this on treasury yield data, we decided to just look at a simple simulation case where we take a simulated Nelson-Siegel model curve and we examine the consequences of applying our decision logic upon that curve, all right? So let's go over here. So this right here at the bottom, this is my simulated yield curve for which I used to test my decision logic, okay? You can see that's a bit noisy. I believe we had the lambda parameter set to around about 0.33. These are annualized bond yields, which we were simulating upon. And what we notice in this particular case, where what I did was I wanted to see what happens when you sell like just one of perhaps two bonds versus if you sell your whole position for a given bond type, right? You can have several different bonds that you've bought, but you'll have them for different types of bond. Different bonds by different prospectuses, and we can group them by that prospectus. So what we find when we do it across just a single bond is that for the most part, what happens is our dynamic portfolio actually falls apart when you just do one bond, because what happens is you start shifting a bit of your duration risk in an unfavorable direction. And moreover, you don't end up fully committing to exiting that part of the curve for your model. So as a result, we can actually see that there are periods where the classic bond ladder will just plain outperform it. However, if we go on to our next case, where you sell two bonds, which is the most of each bond type that we would have within our portfolio, it's a different case. So what's interesting is you'll see that we'll have cases where whenever there are drops within your bond portfolio, all right, that's going to cause you to specifically drops within the value. That corresponds to rises in our yield curve, all right? We can actually more accurately reduce that risk and actually gain a foothold on top of it when our yield curve rises, assuming our model allows us to predict it accurately. To that end, though, you can still see our static curve, which is our blue line, outperforming our adaptive one whenever the yield curve drops, all right? So with that inverse relationship in mind, in order to overcome this limitation, we would probably want to consider adding a buying action to our portfolio as well as just selling, stripping versus doing nothing, all right? And that buying action, we would want to iterate over several possible tenors to help accommodate overcoming that possibility. So yeah, I apologize for how granular this text is, since I imagined having this at a bigger presentation environment. But yeah, the last thing we'll address is just our conclusion. So in summary, yeah, adding a buying action would be desirable for further research. And then second thing is selling and stripping only some bonds may not necessarily lead to desirable results. So thank you very much, and I think we still have some time for questions if you have any. So let's
do we have any questions?
Yeah, if not, it's fine.
So maybe let me just ask one. Do you use real data to do the empirical study? Because
No. So that's I stated earlier that we ended up using a simulation-based data. So when he said collect historical yields at the beginning, that's more for when we actually start running it through a Fed curve. Because if you were able to see some of the curves that we have right here, they are more noisy, but they don't reflect the jumps from like Fed decision making that you would see. So we would of course want to accommodate a more, we can definitely add more on top of our model. The Nelson-Siegel model that he presented allows us to model yield curve dynamics, the endogenous ones, all right? But you can remove that and you can actually basically difference it out, and on that residual, use it through Fish-Wall theorem. You can actually have exogenous factors that you can use to help explain some of the variation in the curve as well.
Okay.
So yeah, modifications can certainly be made, but yeah, to your original question, no, it was simulated. So thank you for asking.
Okay.
Appreciate the chance to clarify.
If no other questions, let's thanks for the two speakers again. And
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate it.